Hello, Miss Cooper. How do you defend yourself against 18 lawsuits?
Oh, you work day and night to support lawyers.
I don't know how you can simply afford it.
I figured out just recently that it's cost over $50,000 just paying legal fees on these suits.
For the record, I haven't received any of that.
I'm just on medicines against me.
Start at the beginning in your own words, please.
Okay. I'm a freelance writer. I live in Manhattan. I'm the author of several hundred articles, 2 of which are about Scientology. I'm also the author of 6 books, one of which is The Scandal of Scientology. I have been studying Scientology since 1968. The last couple of years, the Scientology...
I don't think they can hear you, Miss Cooper. They're mentioning the back of the room.
Okay. The last couple of years, the Scientologists have been telling the people of Clearwater that they've changed. And they've been saying this a lot in the last couple of years, and I certainly haven't noticed it. As I said, the 18th lawsuit was just served on me last week. I am being sued now repeatedly by individual Scientologists who, in some cases I don't even know, sued for supposedly distributing literature at functions I didn't even attend. Part of the purpose in harassing people with lawsuits is to keep deposing them and preventing you from writing or making a living and making you show up in legal depositions. I've been deposed for 19 days total since this started, with I think 4 more coming up in a couple of weeks. There's also been some other harassment in the past 6 months or so, continued calls to me, calls to my family. The Scientologists find out what people's buttons are, meaning, as they put it, and that is the way to get to them, and they know that a way to upset me is to harass my parents, so they have undergone a great deal of harassment as well as my harassment. They've put out libelous publications about me. They've sent letters saying that I will soon be in prison, and saw the Operation Freakout and the attempts that had been made to put me in prison. They've sent false reports about me to the Justice Department, the District Attorney's Office, the IRS. As you know, government agencies have to investigate any complaints that they get. So then Scientology sends out a press release that I am under investigation by the Attorney General's Office and under investigation by the DA and so on. They have put detectives on me. They have put spies on me. A few months ago, they put an attempted spy on my mother to try to get information about me via her and to fix me up with the woman's son so that they could get direct to me. They've canceled my plane somebody canceled my plane to Florida about a month ago, and that is the 3rd time that's happened to me this year when I was traveling. I'd like to say that this was a very good year compared to the previous years, and I'd like to discuss a little bit what it was like to fight Scientology alone starting in 1968, because I was the only one who was speaking out. I mean, this is a wonderful thing where there are people speaking out now, but when I started, absolutely nobody else did. And I was the only person from 1968 until 1973. In 1973, Nan McClain joined, and the 2 of us spoke out publicly. And then in 1976, Gabe Cazares joined, and there were the 3 of us. When I started in 1968, there was no support from the press, there were no rallies, there were no grand juries looking into Scientology, there were no lawyers like Mr. Flynn. There was no peer acceptance about what you were doing. There was just no understanding that anything was wrong. It was somewhat like a social group that people were joining, and it had a veneer that everything was going along well, although based on the testimony you've been hearing, you know that these dirty tricks were going on. But if I would say that they were, people thought that I was the one that was making up these things about them. I'd like to give a little background as to how I got interested in the subject. I never was a Scientologist. My basic interest is as a writer. I like investigative things. In addition, I have a master's degree in psychology, and I studied comparative religion at Harvard for a summer. A friend of mine in 1968 joined Scientology, and he ended up in a mental institution. I'm not saying that one caused the other, but it certainly piqued my curiosity. When he escaped, he came to visit me, and he told me that he was Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ. And he'd been a pretty normal person before then. I then called our mutual friend who had gotten him in and said, thinks he's Christ. And my friend said, well, maybe he really is. So I thought, well, this bears some investigation. I went in and took their weekend course. During the time, I wandered away from the group where they were teaching the particular TRs, as they call them. And I came upon a list of people who, I don't remember for sure if it was a fair game order, but I think it was, because these people were being declared enemies of mankind, and it was very odd terminology. I remember one woman's name was on there, and they declared her an enemy of mankind for pushing 5 men down a flight of stairs. And I thought, how could she do that? I mean, it just didn't ring quite true. And I decided to contact some of these people when I came home. And I think I took about 5 names, the 5 top people. And every one of them had an unlisted number, disconnected phone. Well, this is 1968. The people who was attracting 22, 23 years old. You just by chance, among a group of people, are not going to hit 5 unlisted numbers unless there's a reason for people to go unlist their number. So it began to bother me that, was this so-called respectable church perhaps harassing people? And in that one weekend, I had noted that they had lied about certain things, and I wondered about a church lying to people. And I decided to look in the library and see if I could get any information, any books. And I discovered that all stories had been clipped out of every single magazine pertaining to Scientology. And I wondered whether this church was actually perhaps possibly stealing things. Well, I spent the next couple of years doing research into Scientology. And my first article came out in December of 1969. That's also the month that I received my first death threat. And then a number of mysterious events occurred, both then and during the time within the next year and a half until my book came out. I was followed on several occasions. We found a phone tap on my phone. I was being multiply sued already at that time. A number of people kept calling me and trying to take me out, and it seemed like people were trying to get to me. And this went on for 4 unpleasant years, including 4 lawsuits, one of which was for somebody else's book. And when that happened, I got really annoyed. And I became the first person to sue them for harassment. And this was very shocking to them, because Hubbard had actually written that an enemy, that no one would ever sue Scientology, that they had too much to hide, and that people were criminals who ever attacked the church, and therefore we would just sort of wither away and die. And so they then decided, as we learned later, and I'm going to discuss this later, at that time that they would have to get me and they would have to silence me. Because after my book came out, I began to receive very, very disturbing calls. And the type of things that you've been hearing for the last 3 days were the type of things that people would call and tell me were mysterious things happening to them, thefts, all kinds of very unpleasant things. And yet everybody had this sort of paranoid feeling, and they were afraid to speak out. People were very afraid to speak out. And yet when enough people who don't know each other tell you the same thing happening to them, you begin to realize that something is going on. Well, about October of 1972 started the big campaign to finally silence me or attempt to stop me. That month I received the second of what was ultimately to be 5 anonymous, absolutely disgusting smear letters about me. Okay. This particular one called me a part-time prostitute, and you can imagine how upsetting it is to open up something like that and read it. And during the same period of time, there were a large number of attempts to get into my apartment, which was on the ground floor of the building that I lived in at the time. It was not well guarded. I was quite concerned. I received a tremendous number of really disgusting calls. I remember one day counting 11 calls. Remember that I work as a freelance writer. That means that if I get upsetting calls and I'm unhappy, it's very hard to just pick up and continue writing what you're working on. A lot of nuisance calls then and over the years, just this sort of, you pick up the phone and someone says, oh, what are you doing? And, you got to hang up, and then they call back, and so you have to take the phone off. Excuse me. You have to take the phone off the hook, and then if you're trying to interview somebody, they can't call you back. Well, I finally decided I was going to move to a higher security apartment, even though I really could not afford to do so at the time. I moved on December 15th. On December, the person who took over the apartment was my second cousin. We bore a physical resemblance, but basically because we're about the same age, and she was very petite, and we both had short brown hair at the time. And a series of mysterious circumstances occurred. The important thing was that she opened up the door to someone who had flowers and rang my bell. And I was no longer living there, although my name was still on the door. And Eddie Walters told you about R245, and you've heard of the policy. When Joy opened the door to get these flowers, he unwrapped the flowers, and there was a gun in it. And he took the gun, and he put it at Joy's temple. And he cocked the gun, and we don't know whether it misfired, whether it was empty, and it was a scare technique, what happened. But somehow or other the gun did not go off. And he started choking her, and she was able to break away, and she started to scream, and the person ran away. And she called a detective, and he said it's a very odd attack because there doesn't seem to be any motive for it. And there was no attempted rape, there was no attempted robbery, and why should somebody just suddenly try to kill her? About a week or two later at my new apartment, I received a visit from the FBI. And they informed me that the public relations person for Scientology had claimed to have received a couple of bomb threats and had named me as somebody likely to send bomb threats. So I didn't take the whole visit very seriously, and the FBI asked me if I would mind being fingerprinted, and I said that I would not, and was fingerprinted. At the same time, my cousin Joy's boyfriend had been very, very upset about what happened, and he said, boy, you better let your Scientology spies know that you have moved and where you are, because I don't want anything to happen to her again. And I did, and shortly thereafter, to my new building, half the tenants, which is approximately 300 tenants in the building, received a very, very disgusting anonymous smear letter about me, trying to get me kicked out of the apartment, and saying that I had venereal disease, that I had sexually molested little children. The only thing that was true in the letter was my age, which was not something I wanted known anyway. And it was very, very embarrassing. I was walking through the building, and I heard people talking about me in the elevator, and I was just sort of slinking along, and I was really... A month later, my parents received an anonymous smear letter about me, accusing me of practicing sexual perversions with their clergymen. These were not very good months, so when I was called before a grand jury around this time, at least I didn't think this was anything very serious, and did not bother to retain a lawyer. Had very little money because I had used all my money to move to this more expensive, higher security apartment. And when I got there, they told me that I was the target of an investigation into the bomb threats. And I went and had to hire a lawyer. And every lawyer wanted, the least we could get was $5,000 retainer, which in those years was like paying $10,000, it's, today. And to suddenly have to pay this sum of money and find out that you're in serious trouble, and no one would, the government would not tell my lawyers what the evidence was against me. They wouldn't show me the letters. Anyway, finally I went before the grand jury, and I tried to answer every question as truthfully as I could, and I never took the Fifth Amendment. And they kept asking me again and again, did you ever see this letter? Did you ever touch it? Do you know who might have? And I said, incidentally, yes, that I suspected that Meisler might have sent it to himself, because we'd had some unpleasant confrontations in the press. And then they asked me to step outside of the room, and when I came in, I knew I was in very serious trouble. They asked me what my Social Security number was, whether I was on drugs, and did I realize what I'd said so far. And again, they asked me the same series of questions. And then they said, well, Ms. Cooper, if you've never touched this letter before, could you tell us how your fingerprint got on it? And I felt like a grand piano had just hit me on the head. I fainted sitting up. The whole room just turned upside down. I didn't know what to do. And then, of course, the lawyers wanted more money. And on May 19th, 1973, I was indicted on 3 counts of sending bomb threats through the mail. 2 counts were for the 2 letters. One was for perjury, for saying before the grand jury that I hadn't done it and that I thought this public relations person might have done it. On May 29th, 10 days later, I was arrested and I was arraigned. The next 8 months were a terrible, terrible nightmare in my life that I still feel sometimes that I suffer from to this day. I had 15 years in jail over my head, $15,000 in fines. I was petrified of going to jail, more so perhaps because of my small frame and the fact that I heard that women's federal prisons were rough places. I risked having my career totally destroyed and I had been successful. And as a freelance writer, what editor is ever going to give an assignment to someone who's been indicted or convicted for sending bomb threats to someone they exposed? I was very concerned about the indictment and the trial coming out in the newspapers. The public does not know the difference between indict and convict. And they think that if you're on trial for something, that you must have done it, or where there's smoke, there's fire. I felt that it would be terrible public humiliation that every person I ever knew in New York to read the details of the trial and these accusations. I was most concerned about my parents, who had adopted me when I was 6 years old, and how humiliating it would be for them and their friends to have to explain and to go through a trial like this. During this period of time, I went into a terrible, terrible depression, and a number of my friends, which I can't blame them for, did not stick by me. I was depressing to be with. I had been seeing a man for 5 years and had intended to marry him, and he left as a result of my depression. I had been released on my own recognizance, but I was not allowed to leave the state. And this made it difficult because I had friends in Connecticut and New Jersey, and just all I wanted to do was get away for a weekend. But it was so humiliating to have to go to the court and ask permission to go 20 miles away that I couldn't do it. I went through a period of very, very acute anxiety. I would go to sleep. I couldn't fall asleep till about 4 in the morning, and then I'd wake up about 6 with my stomach just right underneath my throat and worry about what the next day would bring and what was going to happen on the legal hearings. And this went on for 8 months, and I was just totally exhausted, sleeping 2 to 4 hours a day. I couldn't even drag myself around anymore. All of the money I had gone to lawyers, and I went into debt to try to continue to pay for them. In the end, just the main lawyers cost $19,000. I was totally unable to write during this period. Obviously, the depression was very, very bad, and I couldn't concentrate. I attempted to write, but it was really very bad writing. And I'd stopped eating because I was filled with such nausea and exhaustion. I would try to force myself to have a 16-ounce glass of Clamato juice each day and 2 eggs. About half of the time I would just eat it and then go to the bathroom and throw it up. I just couldn't hold food in my stomach. Earlier I'd been operated on, and I was physically ill as well during this period. Mentally, I just totally fell apart about halfway through. I developed for the first time in my life acute agoraphobia. I couldn't leave the house. I think that this really started with this attempted murder that I felt had been intended for me. But then you have to remember that I didn't want to walk around my building because I was hearing people talking about the lady with VD. And I had been very concerned when they were going to arrest me, that they were going to arrest me in the lobby of my building and humiliate me among my neighbors further. So I think this was the genesis of a sudden inability to go out. And some of my friends were very, very good. They would come over and try to force me to get out and to just get my mind off what was going on. It worked for a while. Around September, October, it didn't work anymore. The one friend came over alarmed that I had not left the house for a week, and He said, you just got to walk around the block. And I remember we stepped outside, just about 2 or 3 steps, and I just started crying, and I said, don't make me, I can't do it, I just can't do it. And then I went home and stayed inside for about 2 more weeks. And meanwhile, during this period of time, there was a friend, a new friend, who I met under somewhat mysterious circumstances, but he was very, very helpful, and I obtained an apartment for him in my building, and he did some of the food shopping that I could not get out and do. And his name was Jerry Levin. And at any rate, the worst period of time was approximately 2 weeks before the trial. My lawyers informed me that with a federal case, there was a 95% chance of conviction. They then gave me the good news that for the trial, they wanted my parents to be seated in the front row and watch the entire proceedings. And I kept saying, we can't do that to them. It's going to be awful enough for them to read it in the papers. And they said, you don't understand. If your parents don't show up, a jury doesn't realize that, you know, this is what you want. They're just going to... They felt that the one circumstance that might get me acquitted was this unusually close relationship with my parents. On top of it, I was going through some Scientology material that I had obtained, and there was the name of Jerry Levin. Now, I felt horribly betrayed, but at the same time, I simply did not want to believe it. I was very naive, and I kept saying, well, it's a very common name, especially in a city like New York. Meanwhile, we had tried every single move possible to get the trial stopped, but I was in a very, very nervous state, and it became impossible for me to be tested correctly. And we went to some doctors who said that they thought the only thing that might work would be if I would go into a state where I didn't know what was going on, meaning sodium pentothal or truth serum, because to do that, you have to be, you're unconscious. It's like an operation. So the problem was we couldn't find a doctor who would give me a sodium pentothal test, because by this time I weighed 83 pounds. I had started at about 98, and it became very, very dangerous to go and put somebody under as if for an operation when you weighed that. And I kept saying I didn't care if the operation, if the sodium pentothal killed me, because if I had to stand trial for what I didn't do and humiliate everyone and go through this humiliation, that I would just as soon be dead anyway. And we finally did find a doctor 2 weeks before trial who gave me a sodium pentothal test. I was unconscious for 7 hours. I don't know what I said during it. I do know that when I came to, my mother was standing there, and I said, what happened? What did I say? And she just said, it's okay. It's all over. There won't be a trial. The government wanted to save face because they don't like to admit that they've made a mistake. So they said that they would postpone the trial, but they would not actually drop the charges at that time. They also ordered me to see a psychiatrist, which I felt was very humiliating. The government did not drop the charges, and for 2 years after all this, I still had to worry on a daily basis whether one day there was going to be a trial, and all of these things that I was afraid of, the publicity and so on, was going to happen. The next year was 1974, and there were a number of new lawsuits against me. Continued harassment, including harassment of my family and their clergymen, new spies. By the summer, which would be about 7 months after the worst period of this whole thing, I remember one of my friends said that that was the first time they'd seen me smile in a year and a half. And I had decided, in fact, that I was going to try to get back this gentleman that I was interested in. And I threw a birthday party to have an excuse to invite him to something and sent him an invitation. And he then wrote me the most incredible letter back. And what I found out was that there was then a 5th anonymous smear letter about me. This one sent to him and his bosses, and he would never talk to me again and never has. In 1975, the charges against me were finally dropped. But during this period, they started a new type of harassment, and that is I began receiving things in the mail, such as copies of, I had kept a diary from when I was 17 to about 20, and there was my diary suddenly coming back to me, copies of letters that I had sent out, my carbon copies of it. The psychiatrist report that Mr. Dardanot explained that he stole. In 1976, the charges were, no, excuse me, in late 75, the charges were finally dropped. At that point, some very bizarre things happened that it wasn't until later I would learn were part of another attempt to put me in jail. But, for example, somebody was calling a number of my close friends, imitating my voice to a degree that was good enough that some people had stopped talking to me, others called and yelled at me, why should I have called and been so rude and so on. I kept saying, I didn't call. And then I went to a writers' meeting and someone said, gee, how was Washington? I haven't been to Washington in 2 years. They said, you called from Washington. I didn't understand at the time why these things were being done. Also I was with a group of writers and someone showed me a joke. And I realized afterwards that it appeared to be an attempt to get my fingerprint again. And I became very, very upset because after all, I had a quote record, end quote. And I was very concerned about the possibility of more bomb threats. There are many, many more things that were done to me over the years. I'm trying to summarize a little bit. In December of 1976, I became very, very tired of it all. By that time, there were 9 lawsuits against me. Right before I went to court, all the stuff that was remailed to me that had been mailed in the past, sort of a subtle blackmail kind of, this is what's going to happen if you don't settle. Scientology wanted me to settle quite badly. Also, they convinced me at that time that they had changed and that they really were a very nice organization and that by my continued statements and stance against them and my book, I was preventing them from doing the good deeds that they wanted to do and that they were doing by bringing up the bad things all the time. And in December of 76, I agreed, in a sense, the easiest thing is just say that I agreed, in a sense, not to badmouth them, and they agreed not to badmouth me. While they were telling me that they had changed, unbeknownst to me, there was a man named Michael Meisner, and he had been a top GO operative, and they were holding him under gag and handcuff. And this man knew that I had been criminally framed, and he knew about a lot of things that had been going on. In the summer of 1977, the FBI raided the 3 Scientology organizations. On October 12, 1977, the FBI called me. Now remember that this was a 5-year period that I had never been able to prove my innocence. The government considered me a criminal. I had a quote record, end quote. And the FBI called out of the blue and said, we have just received evidence that you were innocent of those original charges. And I hung up the phone and cried. And I, in fact, tried to reach that person that was no longer talking to me, but he had since remarried. I worked with the FBI for the next couple of years. I did learn before, in the investigation that was going on, that the murder attempt on Joy was seemingly intended for me by Scientology. I learned that Scientology had broken into my New York lawyer's office, and this was one of many lawyers they went to break into, but first one. And I learned, which was to me the most important thing, was that they had framed me in 1972. And I'm going to skip ahead a little to some of the stuff that, there were more lawsuits. Anyway, at the end of 1979, I finally saw the documents that had been seized. There were 23,000 documents. And there were 23,000 made available to the public. And there were 2 documents that finally made it very clear that I had been criminally framed. And it was very important to me that at last I was publicly able to proclaim my innocence and not worry about what anybody would say, and that I always felt that I had to hide the fact that I had been arrested. And if I would meet someone and say he had any political ambitions, I wouldn't tell him why, but I would quickly stop seeing him for his sake. So it was something that I was hiding, and it was affecting my life in various ways. We found one document that apparently indicated that they were considering the use of the mafia on me, but that they had decided instead to criminally frame me. so that Scientology would not look bad. We found a number of documents that proved that this fellow who had been helping me, I thought, during the period that I was having such a bad time, he was calling in a diary into Scientology as to what I was doing, how close I was to suicide, and, cheering me on like, she can't sleep again, and she's talking suicide, wouldn't this be great for Scientology? Very painful reading the diary of somebody that you think is a friend and is wishing you dead and working in your behalf towards that direction. Incidentally, this particular fellow's name was Jerry Levin. They changed his name to Don Alverzo, and he became one of the biggest dirty tricks operatives down in Clearwater. He also was the person sent to Washington who planted the bug in the IRS. We saw a document called Operation Freakout, which Mr. Flynn started to show you before. I think, if you remember, I had mentioned these very bizarre phone calls, people posing as me. We think that they were trying to test my voice because part of Operation Freakout, Operation Freakout consisted of 6 different ways to try to get me jailed again since the charges had been dropped. One of the ways was to call in bomb threats in a voice that would sound like mine. Another was to write bomb threats very similar to the original ones, but pasted on Writer's Digest stationery so that they would come to the conclusion that the FBI would come to the conclusion that this must have been done by a writer. Operation Freakout consisted of plans to have somebody pose as me to find out what I was wearing, have someone dress like me, look like me, and then crack up publicly and try to get me arrested for that person threatening to bomb various places. The other documents that I saw was that a number of these lawsuits against me were being maliciously created. For example, they were bringing my book, The Scandal of Scientology, into countries where it had not even been published. And they were saying, so brought the book in so we can sue. The reason for those terrible calls that I'd mentioned was that they had put my name up on walls throughout Manhattan and with my phone number so that people would give me these calls. Operation Owl was in there. Incidentally, I don't know if I mentioned that Operation Freakout originated in Clearwater, even though the basis of the attack was against a New York resident, namely me. Mr. Flynn showed you Operation Owl, which also originated in Clearwater. A copy of my diary, the one that had been mailed to me, was found in a file marked National Council of Churches because they had hidden a lot of their the stuff that they shouldn't have had. And there were also things that I didn't even know that they had done. For example, my mother once complained to me that she couldn't figure out why for the last few years my father kept being audited again and again, and nothing ever turned up. He's an excruciatingly honest person. And there was an order to give an anonymous tip to the IRS that my father was evading taxes. Now, I don't know if that was the cause of it, but I'm saying that it was this type of thing. I also learned from the documents that they were suing me for things that were true. For example, they repeatedly sued me for saying that Charles Manson was a Scientologist. And there were 50 to 100 documents showing how they were trying to hide the fact that Charles Manson had studied Scientology. There were surveillance reports. I think I'd mentioned that I'd been followed at various times. I was pretty sure of it. It's kind of spooky sitting there and reading, she turned up 80th Street, walked for 5 minutes there, stopped in the candy store. And there were reports that my friends were being harassed. There was a notation to cause trouble with this gentleman that I mentioned. There were spies reports and tape transcripts of telephone conversations that I had had with people. I think I spoke to 60 Minutes when I was down here in Clearwater last, and I said then that I had been saying that these types of things had been going on, and people kept saying, well, what is she talking about? This is a church. And it was incredible vindication to look at these documents and see that everything I had said about Scientology since 1968 was true, and that they had turned out to be worse than anything I said or had even imagined. Now, Scientology at that time had said that they had changed, and I know because Gabe and Maggie Gazaris mailed me the St. Pete Times and the Clearwater Sun, and I read that this is what they told you. While they were saying that, they had learned where I was in Washington, D.C., in fact, the Washington Hilton, and planted a bug by my bed there and also a bug on the telephone during this period of time while they were making these statements in Clearwater about how they had changed. And I do not believe that they have changed, and that is one of the reasons, or the main reason I wanted to come here and warn you, because I have been studying them for many years, and I have heard them say that they have changed, and gee, they may even issue that kind of statement after this is over. Well, there were some things that were said, but, we don't do that anymore kind of thing. And I've heard it before, even before I started researching Scientology, they were saying this. For example, in 1965, there was something called the Australian Inquiry, a commission to look into Scientology. Anyway, after studying Scientology, the commission came to the conclusion that Scientology, quote, Scientology is evil, its techniques evil, its practice a serious threat medically, morally, and socially, its adherents often sadly deluded and mentally ill. And at that time, Scientology issued a statement that, of course, they had changed. In 1968, I believe, was the Foster Report when the English held an inquiry to look into Scientology. And Scientology issued a statement that fair game had been canceled and that the disconnect policy had been canceled and that everything had changed. In 1975, they had World Prayer Day, and the press almost believed that time that they had changed. In December of 1976, when I settled with them, I believed they had changed. In 1977, when the FBI raided them, they said that they had changed. In 79, when statements came out about what was in the documents, and in 1980, again, they were telling people that they had changed. And my final point is that I believe that they haven't changed. I believe that their basic policy, ever since the policy was first written, has been the fair game policy. The policy is to trick people. The policy is to sue people. The policy is to lie to people and to destroy them. I certainly know from a personal standpoint. And I've only briefly told you some of the things that they've done to me so that you're not deceived by their true nature. I've been studying them 14 years and unfortunately have been a victim of this cult for 14 years. And I believe that Scientology has never changed, will never change, and will keep issuing statements to people saying that they have changed.
Thank you for your, thank you for your story, and thank you for the evidence that relates specifically to Clearwater. I have at various times talked to members of the Church of Scientology, have told me that they have changed too. As recently as Hubert Gents of a few months ago, who said that they have changed. And I thank you for telling us the story. I don't know every story today seems to get more incredible as the people come on, and I don't know how you could survive what you have survived mentally. You must be one hell of a woman.